He didn't bark when the man lied. He barked when the man moved his fingers. 3 silent gestures and the retired canine launched across the courtroom, pinning a lawyer to the floor. But this wasn't a random outburst. It was recognition. This dog had seen that signal before, years ago, in blood and fire. And now, in front of a judge, he exposed the truth no one else saw. The killer never left. Think you can spot the moment everything changed? Watch closely. If this hooked you, like, subscribe, and drop a comment. What do you think triggered him? And where are you watching from? The courtroom buzzed with a quiet that wasn't quite peace. It was the kind of silence born from routine paper shuffling, the soft clack of shoes on marble, the hushed murmurs of legal aids. But beneath it all was a tension that hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Most of the people sitting in the gallery believed they were here for a civil lawsuit, property dispute, insurance fraud, something beige and bureaucratic, nothing worth staying past lunch. But seated 3 rows from the bench was Deshaun Briggs, tall, black, with eyes that had seen more than they said. Dressed in a plain dark suit that fit just right, no shine, no ego, just function. He sat upright, unmoving, like someone who'd spent years waiting in rooms where no one clapped when he entered. By his feet lay Zorro. The black and tan German shepherd rested silently, still as shadow, his body curled but taut like a coiled spring. Deshaun didn't glance down. He didn't need to. Zorro only shifted when the air shifted, and at that moment he was silent, breathing slow, pretending to nap. Only pretending. The defendant's chair was still empty, but his name hung in bold type on the docket, Julius Cain. No one in the room flinched reading it. They should have. Anyone familiar with the streets of South Marlin Heights would have paused. Julius Cain wasn't just a defendant. He was a ghost story with a gold chain. A whispered legend of backroom deals, silent bodies, and ironclad alibis. For 5 years he'd eluded every charge, always walking clean. Till now. Deshaun adjusted his tie, not because he was nervous, but because the courtroom lights were always colder than they looked. The prosecuting attorney, a young ADA with ambition in her heels and fire in her voice, leaned toward him. "He's here," she whispered, "and his lawyer's different." The side door opened, and Julius Cain entered like he owned the wood grain beneath his shoes. He wore a gray suit that probably cost more than most people's rent, dark sunglasses indoors, and a lazy smirk that said he'd already won. But it wasn't him that made Zorro lift his head. It was the man walking beside him, the defense attorney. He was slender, pale, with a silk tie the color of dried blood. His steps were deliberate, eyes like sharpened obsidian, the kind that didn't blink unless necessary. But it was his hands that mattered, subtle, controlled. And in the instant he raised one hand, just a flick of fingers to brush a strand of hair from his temple, Zorro growled. It wasn't loud. Not yet. It was low, vibrational, felt more than heard. Deshaun's eyes cut down immediately. Zorro's ears were pinned back. His body hadn't moved, but his lip curled just enough to show the edge of a tooth. Deshaun's jaw locked. That wasn't a threat growl, that was memory. Deshaun placed a calm hand near Zorro's collar. Not touching Zorro, refused to touch the life of the room, but close enough to anchor. The dog didn't break his stare. The defense lawyer took his place beside Cain, unfazed. The judge entered moments later, the usual dance of rising and order. And the trial began. Opening statements were clinical. The ADA walked through the case, the property, the shell companies, the financial trails. She painted Cain as a predator in the guise of a businessman. Nothing new, nothing risky, nothing sharp enough to draw blood. Then it was the defense's turn. The lawyer stood, smiled, introduced himself with a name no one remembered. His voice was silk on tile, but his fingers, those damn fingers, they moved again. Small gestures, thumb to forefinger, palm tapped twice, and Zorro barked. Not a whimper, not a yelp. One sharp, resonant bark that silenced the entire room. Every eye turned. The judge's gavel slammed down. Deshaun stood slowly. He's trained. He doesn't bark unless there's something wrong. He just interrupted a court of law, the judge snapped. But the defense attorney smiled, too smooth, too clean, like someone who'd already counted the possible reactions and rehearsed his smile for each. Zorro sat back down, but his eyes never left the lawyer's hands. Outside the courthouse during recess, the buzz was already growing. Reporters speculated on the outburst. Was it trauma from a previous case? A reactive animal? Deshaun stood alone near the entrance, the leash in one hand, his mind racing. Because Zorro wasn't just any canine, he was ex-military, trained in micro-gesture threat analysis, narcotics, weapons, and signals. More importantly, Zorro never forgot a hand signal, and Deshaun had seen that twitch before. Years ago, deep undercover inside a crew that used silent codes instead of phones. The same twitch, the same palm pattern. The man using it back then had died in a raid. So who the hell was this lawyer that night? Deshaun reviewed everything. Court footage, gesture logs, behavioral flags, and Zorro? He sat in the corner of their small motel room, still alert, growling under his breath every time the frame paused on the defense's hands. Deshaun whispered, "You remember him, don't you?" Zorro thumped his tail once. Not yes, not no, just presence. Like he was saying, "We've seen this before, and it ain't over." The motel room smelled faintly of black coffee, wet fur, and old carpet cleaner, but Deshaun didn't notice any of it. His eyes remained fixed on the frozen frame playing over and over on the laptop screen right there, that subtle flick of the wrist, that curved finger pressed against the opposite palm. Zorro growled again, low and steady, not out of anger but remembrance. That twitch, that sign, it wasn't just familiar, it was intimate. It belonged to a world they both had buried years ago in exchange for a second chance. And now, like smoke leaking from beneath a locked door, it was seeping back in. Deshaun leaned back in the cracked vinyl chair, hands steepled, his mind slipping not into panic but calculation. The man they called Counselor Avery, the slick lawyer who now sat beside Julius Kane, wasn't always a man of the law. Deshaun had seen him before, when his name was whispered between slats of rotting wood in underground poker dens and backroom boxing rings. When he didn't wear silk ties but leather gloves soaked in blood. His real name had been Drex, short for Drexel Marion, one of the silent founding hands behind the Mosaic Syndicate, a hybrid gang of financiers, former enforcers, and dead-eyed operatives whose greatest weapon wasn't a gun but secrecy. Drex never pulled the trigger. He signed papers, moved shells, and issued orders with his hands, using coded gestures to run operations across entire city grids. And 5 years ago, Deshaun had infiltrated his world. Back then, Deshaun wasn't Deshaun Briggs, private consultant, or handler of retired K9s. He had been Agent Briggs, deep cover assigned by the Organized Crimes Division under a buried division of the Bureau, with a mission that never made it to court files. Infiltrate, disrupt, dismantle. The Mosaic Syndicate had been impenetrable, a myth in suits, and Drex was the myth's mouth. Deshaun had walked among them not as a cop but as a collector, a man who cleaned up debts and made messes disappear. He had earned trust by bleeding for it. He had pulled triggers not to kill but to convince. He had lied better than they did. And Drex? Drex had bought it. Though Zorro had been assigned to Deshaun after his handler was killed during a raid gone sideways. No one wanted to pair a purebred, line-tainen baby with an agent deep undercover. But Zorro wasn't ordinary. The dog had a mind like a soldier and instincts like a scalpel. Deshaun didn't trust him at first. But after the night in that warehouse on Ellison Street, trust wasn't an option, it was survival. The night had gone black too fast. A shipment was arriving from the docks. Drex had insisted on inspecting it personally. An unusual move for a man who preferred distance. But that night, he showed up, surrounded by shadows, and walked the floor like a ghost, giving no warning, offering no comfort. Something felt wrong. Zorro sensed it first. The dog stiffened in the back seat of the rusted Impala Deshaun had been driving, his hackles racing long before any move. As Deshaun walked into the warehouse, Zorro followed, low and silent, and when the first shot rang out, Deshaun hadn't known who fired it. Zorro launched. The bullet tore through the shoulder of a man lunging from the catwalk. But it wasn't that man Zorro went after. It was Drex. Drex had drawn a silenced pistol with surgical ease, aiming at Deshaun's back. He never made the shot. Zorro's leap was, his jaws clamped on Drex's forearm, snapping bones like dry twigs. The man screamed, dropped the weapon, and went down hard. The memory of that scream, deep, wounded, primal, still echoed in Deshaun's mind. Sometimes at 3 a.m., Deshaun had dragged Zorro out of there bleeding, both of them bleeding as fire erupted behind them. The bust had gone bad. Too many variables. Too many lies within lies. By the time the smoke cleared, Drex had vanished. The Bureau presumed him dead. A body had turned up weeks later, badly burned, wearing Drex's watch with dental matches that almost confirmed. Case closed. Except it was now, watching Zorro react to the lawyer's hands, the same rhythm. The same broken motion of a once dominant wrist now slightly stiff, as if rebuilt after trauma. Deshawn knew the truth. Drex had survived, changed his name, bought a new face with courtroom polish, but he couldn't unlearn how to move, and that, ultimately, was his flaw. "Zorro," Deshawn said softly, standing, pacing. The dog looked up, alert. "You remember what he did? You remember that night?" The dog rose, silent, tail low, eyes locked on Deshawn. His presence was a mirror. They had both seen too much to pretend this was coincidence. Deshawn opened a locked duffel bag hidden under the bed. Inside were remnants of a life left behind, false ideas, burner phones, a sealed flash drive with data the Bureau had never cleared for deletion, and a notebook. Inside it, codes and symbols, maps of gestures, a language Drex had created to rule in silence. Deshawn flipped through until he found it, page 32, symbol 14. 3 fingers, thumb bent, rotate at the wrist. Signal, execute. He had just seen it again, today, in court. The timing wasn't random. Drex wasn't there just to defend Kane. He was activating something. The thought sliced through Deshawn's composure like glass through canvas. He stood frozen, every piece snapping into place. This wasn't a trial, it was a signal hub. Drex was using the court as a message center. The courtroom wasn't a defense arena, it was a hive. Deshawn glanced back at Zorro, whose stance had shifted. Alert, ready. They had buried this man once. But ghosts don't stay down if the ground was never consecrated. And suddenly, Deshawn understood this case wasn't about Kane at all. It was about restarting something they once ended. And Drex was the fuse. Zorro paced toward the door, head low, tail stiff. Deshawn grabbed the leash, slipped on his coat, and checked his side holster. Not because he was planning to use it, but because some memories demanded more than just questions. And as they stepped out into the humid Marlin night, toward a city that had already forgotten the names in its alleyways, Deshawn muttered, not to Zorro but to himself, "We're back in it, old man." And Zorro didn't look back. The next morning, the courthouse hallway felt tighter, the fluorescent lights harsher, the air too clean to be trustworthy. Deshawn walked in alone this time, no leash, no Zorro. Not because the dog wasn't ready, but because Deshawn needed to move without attention. The day before had stirred something, and today, he wasn't there as a handler or witness. He was there as a watcher. He passed the security checkpoint with nods of recognition, but no conversation. His badge clipped to his inner coat, not his lapel. Inside the courtroom, the walls felt like they were listening. The same judge presided, the same prosecutor stood poised, and the same defense team wore smugness like tailored suits. Kane sat motionless beside Drex, now Counselor Avery, who offered a faint nod to the gallery, his hands folded politely, fingers still as death. Deshawn didn't sit this time. Instead, he stood against the rear wall near the press bench, where the sound of shutter clicks was steady but subdued. From here, he could see them all. And he wasn't looking at Kane. He was watching the jury. 12 men and women, average faces, intent expressions, all carefully vetted by both legal teams. But Deshawn had reviewed the footage from day one overnight, frame by frame, searching for something his instincts told him was there. At exactly 11:23 a.m. yesterday, during the ADA's statement about Kaya's offshore accounts, Drex had leaned toward Kaya, made a casual brush of his tie, and then adjusted his cuff, 3 fingers, tap tap. It was subtle, too subtle, but Deshawn knew the code. He had paused that frame. In the upper right corner, barely visible, sat Juror 7. Male, white, mid-40s, beard trimmed, glasses modern, a faded scar just beneath his left ear, a remnant. Deshawn now recalled from a warehouse explosion 6 years ago in a case that was never solved. The man's name on the jury sheet read Daniel H. Reeves. Nothing remarkable, no criminal record, nothing flagged, but Deshawn knew that name. Knew it because Daniel Reeves used to go by Danny Hex. Used to wear a black denim vest with the mosaic insignia stitched under the collar just behind the neck. He was a runner for the syndicate. Not high-ranking, not a killer, but he had proximity. Enough to know the language, enough to be useful. And now he was on the jury. At 11:23 a.m., as Drex tapped out the coded message, Danny Hex Juror 7 nodded. Just once. Barely a movement. Just enough to say, received. Deshawn hadn't expected that. He'd believed Drex was working the court from the defense bench. He hadn't realized Drex was working it from inside the jury box too. Now, watching Reeves sit there, composed, taking notes, Deshawn felt the hair rise on his arms. It wasn't just a nod. It was compliance, coordination, and perhaps something worse. The ADA approached the bench with a stack of surveillance footage and financial reports. The judge, weary and exacting, waved her forward. Meanwhile, Deshawn angled to the far right of the gallery, near a narrow alcove where a wall-mounted monitor cycled through closed-circuit feeds of the courtroom. The screen flickered through multiple angles. Entryway, gallery, overhead shot of the jury, prosecution and defense tables. There it was again, 11:23 a.m. The camera angle from the rear upper balcony showed it clearly. Drex's left hand, 3 fingers together, a thumb brace, followed by a slide toward his watch. Less than 2 seconds. Natural, almost forgettable. Unless you knew the language, and Juror 7 Reeves looked down at his notepad. Then up, then nodded. Not to anyone specific, not dramatically, just a single bob of the head. Enough to activate, enough to trigger something unseen. Deshawn's jaw tensed. He had known the Mosaic Syndicate to be precise, layered like a vault. But embedding an Exoner into the jury meant Drex wasn't just defending Kane. He was orchestrating the verdict. That courtroom was a stage, and Deshawn was standing in the audience of a script already written. He pulled out his burner phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 4 years. Langston answered, a voice, gravelly and tired. "It's Briggs," Deshawn said, scanning the courtroom. "I need a flag pulled on a juror. Reeves. Daniel H. Check any known associations with Drexel Marion." A pause. "You sure?" "I'm sure," Deshawn said. "And I need you to check the jury camera feeds. Day 1, timestamp 11:23. I think we've got a sleeper." Another pause. "And if he's not alone, then this trial's a shell," Deshawn muttered. "And Drex is reactivating the network." He hung up without waiting. Back in the courtroom, the ADA presented a slideshow of real estate purchases under shell companies tied to Kane. The juror appeared attentive. Juror 7 even took notes, his pen moving steadily. Drex leaned back, smiled faintly, and scratched his wrist, another symbol Deshawn recognized. Zorro would have barked. Now Deshawn's instincts barked in his place. From his coat pocket, he pulled out the notebook again. Page 39. Symbol 22A, wrist rack followed by index point. Translation, next phase ready. He looked up. Juror 7 had just placed a hand inside his jacket. Fished out something out. Gum? No, a toothpick. He placed it in his mouth and tapped it twice against his lower lip. Page 41. Symbol 9 factor, FHOM. The room was buzzing with the ADA's energetic rhythm, but underneath, a second language was moving. Silent, methodical, dangerous. And Deshawn realized something else. This trial wasn't about Kane's freedom. It was about building trust. Drex wasn't defending Kane to protect him. He was showing the network, what was left of it, that their system still worked, that their people could still move unnoticed, that even after years underground, the Mosaic Syndicate could still speak without speaking, judge without law, decide without evidence. And if Juror 7 was just the face they let be seen, Deshawn turned his eyes toward Juror 3, female, late 30s, too composed, and Juror, he wasn't sure yet, but the shadows in the box were shifting, and he was running out of time. The early evening haze draped itself over the city like a warning whispered through concrete. From a rooftop 2 blocks away from the courthouse, Deshawn stood with a pair of military-grade optics trained on the narrow alley behind the judicial parking garage. His phone buzzed once, a text, from Langston Daniel Reeves, aka Danny Hex, former asset flagged under Mosaic Tier 2. No public record of exit, no formal debrief, no federal clearance. Another message came seconds later. Also, Drexel Marion listed as deceased in 2018. But there's a sealed file, classified under Joint Task Omega. Deshawn's gut tightened. Joint Task Omega hadn't been touched in nearly 6 years. Not since the Bureau gave up on breaking the syndicate from within. Which meant if Drex was still alive and walking freely in courtrooms, and if he was protected, it meant the game was bigger than Deshawn had thought. Bigger than Kane. Bigger than this case. Bigger than the courtroom. He zoomed the scope on the rear door. Sure enough, Drex exited first. Alone. He wasn't looking over his shoulder because he didn't have to. He knew no one was watching. No one but Deshawn. And that meant Drex was making a statement. The way he walked, the deliberate pace, the subtle movements of his right hand by his hip half movements sharp and old. Not mannerisms, not habits. Commands. Ghost, the kind of code that once triggered laundering accounts, moved drugs from port cities, had men vanish or die with no documentation. Zorro would have caught them instantly. Because that's exactly what he was built for. When Zorro was brought into the program, he wasn't selected for obedience. He was selected for awareness. A hypercognitive loop animal, tested for his ability to detect intent before action. The kind of training no public canine unit ever saw. His final trial before field deployment wasn't sniffing out narcotics or chasing down decoys. It was decoding gesture-based command strings in a darkened warehouse, surrounded by trained actors. Hand signals, eye movement, posture, micro-flexing fingers, subtle shifts in heel angle, all elements of the mosaic language. The same language Drex had built. Zorro passed the test in record time. Because he didn't just respond to gestures. He remembered who they came from. Back in the apartment, Deshawn opened the second of 2 briefcases he'd stashed beneath the floorboards. A black composite box stamped with the OCD insignia. Inside, a data drive, a worn tactical notebook, and a small black clicker used during Zorro's mosaic simulations. He pressed the button twice. Zorro, lying by the door, stood immediately. No bark, no movement, just eyes locked forward. Zorro sat, ears forward. Still had it. "This isn't just coincidence, boy," Deshawn muttered, the tension in his jaw tightening with each word. "They brought him back for something, not Kane, not money. They're relighting the syndicate." He thought back to the last mission briefing before they shut the mosaic files down. There had been rumors. Whispers about Drex wanting out. Not because of heat from the feds, but because he didn't believe in the chaos anymore. He wanted control, full structure. He wanted to legalize the machine. No longer underground embedded. Clean fronts, legal shields, institutional power. Becoming a lawyer wasn't cover, it was evolution. Deshawn pulled out the tactical notebook and flipped to a series of ink-drawn diagrams, circles layered within triangles, names coded by numbers, signal paths from city to city. Drex had mapped his empire like a hydra with invisible heads. Some of these nodes were eliminated in the raids, others vanished, but 2 had remained untouched. Cleo Point and Grey Tree Reserve, both legal trusts, both hidden inside foundations and law firms. One of them, Deshawn suddenly remembered, had an address listed just blocks from the courthouse, a building he'd passed twice this week. But it wasn't the building that made him pause. It was the name of the foundation on the glass, Mosaic Legal Fellowship. Drex hadn't just disappeared. He'd turned the old symbols into a credential. He wasn't the syndicate's leftover, he was the syndicate rebuilt, in plain sight, wearing a tie and quoting statutes but still speaking in the old code, activating old soldiers and daring anyone to call it out. Deshawn exhaled slowly. Zorro padded toward him, watching his handler like he used to in war zones, ready without needing explanation. Deshawn looked at the dog, the last connection to a mission the government had buried, and whispered, "They think we forgot, but they didn't count on memory." He opened the laptop, pulled up court footage from that morning. At precisely 9:47 a.m., during a moment the ADA asked about Kane's second offshore bank, Drex's hand moved in a 3-ounce pattern against the underside of the table. Deshawn replayed it, again, then paused. Zorro growled, quiet, steady. It wasn't recognition of a movement, it was confirmation of language. Zorro didn't just react to threats. He remembered intent, the kind of intent that operated with precision beneath the mask of order. And now Drex wasn't just signaling jurors, he was activating them. Deshawn began cross-referencing other cases Drex had defended. White-collar crimes, mostly financial. In each case, the defendant walked. No news coverage, no jury commentary, just reasonable doubt. It wasn't that Drex was a good lawyer. It was that the verdicts were preloaded, and if Drex had returned to the Mosaic network not as its legal protector but as its operational head, then this trial was just another pulse to dormant cells. A message, we are live. Deshawn leaned back, heart beating like distant war drums. His hands moved instinctively, 2 fingers up, palm out, clockwise twist, an old signal used in the field to tell Zorro to ready for recon. The dog stiffened, silent, unblinking. He was already ahead. The courtroom on the third day felt colder, sharper, like the building itself sensed what was coming. Deshawn sat beside Zorro this time, back in handler mode. But beneath the surface he was calculating everything. The timing of Drex's signals, the visual tics among the jury, the coded body language layered between each objection and every... He hadn't said a word to the ADA yet, hadn't shown her the footage, hadn't handed over the symbols or the diagrams. This was still his mission, and after what the system had done after it let Drex rise through the ranks of legitimacy while the agents who risked everything were erased, he wasn't ready to hand over the knife. Not yet. Zorro, sitting quietly at his side, radiated tension. The dog's ears never settled. His breath stayed shallow. His eyes never blinked for long. Every time Drex raised his hand or shifted in his seat, Zorro's focus zeroed in. At exactly 10:06 a.m., Drex leaned forward to whisper something to Kane, his left hand making a casual sweep across his tie, and Zorro's body stiffened like a loaded spring. Deshawn whispered, "Stay," but it wasn't for the dog, it was for himself. The judge asked the defense to rise. Drex stood, his voice smooth, measured, laying out an objection tied to financial records being prejudicial. It wasn't about the words, though. It was about his fingers. As he gestured toward the screen, his pinky tapped 3 times against his ring finger in perfect rhythm. Mosaic code for observe me, then act. The ADA rolled her eyes, mid-responser, but Deshawn wasn't looking at her. He was watching Juror 9, who straightened her back and tapped her pen once on the pad. Zorro shifted again. A small whimper. Nothing loud, just enough to make Deshawn's hand tighten on the leash. But it wasn't the leash that would hold him back. Drex turned to return to his seat, and in doing so brushed shoulders with Kane. That contact, intentional, crisp, was the trigger. Zorro moved. Not with hesitation, not like a startled pet, like a missile. 1 second he was by Deshawn's foot, the next he was airborne. The bark that came out wasn't a warning, it was judgment. Sharp, deep, resonant, it scasped. The judge slammed the gavel and yelled, "Remove the animal now." But it was too late. Zorro landed directly between Drex and Kane. His body rigid, jaws bared, pushing Drex back with a low growl that chilled the air. Drex stumbled slightly, caught off guard, one hand flying to brace himself against the defense table, and that's when it happened. In the chaos, as bailiffs rushed forward, and Deshawn rose to intercept fear, Zorro's front paw caught the edge of Drex's suit jacket and pulled down hard. Something small flew out from inside the inner pocket. It hit the ground with a metallic clink and rolled in a slow arc under the glare of courtroom lights. A bracelet. Thin, black, leather-bound with a tiny brass plate on its center. Everyone in the room stared. Zorro stopped growling, his head now lowered beside the object, nostrils flaring. Deshawn saw it before anyone else could react. He didn't have to pick it up. He already knew what it was. The brass plate was etched with a symbol nearly forgotten. A snake coiled around a compass star. The crest of the original Mosaic Syndicate, a visual insignia used only during the early days of their formation, when blood rituals and silence pacts replaced ink and paper. The same symbol Deshawn had burned into memory during his deep ops phase. A symbol the government swore had vanished after the dismantling raids. And now it was lying on the floor of a federal courtroom, sliding gently to a stop at the toe of Deshawn's boot. The judge screamed for order. The bailiffs reached for Zorro, who now stood protectively in front of the bracelet, tail straight out, body tense but unmoving. He wasn't attacking, he was shielding. Deshawn stepped forward, raising both hands. "Let me," he said calmly, "he's responding to a threat. The hell he is, Drex snapped, trying to regain control, his face pale but composed. Your dog just assaulted me. Deshawn ignored him. He knelt beside Zorro, fingers brushing the bracelet. The instant his hand touched the cool metal, he felt it like touching a ghost's breath. This wasn't just a relic. It was a key. He looked up at Drex and said, low enough only the lawyer could hear, "You kept it. After all these years, you kept it." Drex's mask didn't crack, but his silence was louder than denial. The judge again demanded the dog be removed, and Deshawn clipped the leash on Zorro's collar. "We're leaving," he said. "But that," he added, holding up the bracelet, "is evidence." The idiot stood from her table, stunned. "Mr. Briggs, what exactly is going on here?" Deshawn turned to the bench. "Your Honor, I'm invoking Section 12 of the Witness Protection Integrity Act. I need a private chamber and federal presence. This man," he said, pointing directly at Drex, "is a—" The courtroom exploded. Drex remained still. Kane leaned back slowly, expression unreadable, his eyes darting between Deshawn, the bracelet, and Drex. A moment passed, then another. Then Drex spoke. "This is absurd. That bracelet is a gift. It has no connection to anything you're implying." But Deshawn had already pulled his wallet and placed his former credentials face up on the table. Not public ID, not his consulting badge, but his old clearance card, the one with the red stripe. Mosaic Task Force. The ADA went pale. The judge blinked. The jurors shifted. Zorro stared, and Drex moved his hand. Left pinky flexed twice against his palm. Deshawn saw it, so did Zorro. The chamber door closed with a heavy click, muffling the chaos of the courtroom behind it. Deshawn stood in the small wood-paneled room beside the ADA and the presiding judge. Zorro seated quietly at his feet, his breathing calm but his eyes still locked in absently. The bracelet now lay in a sealed evidence pouch on the table, but its weight hadn't left Deshawn's palm. The silence in the room was thick with tension as the judge studied him, her voice measured but firm. "Mr. Briggs, you've just upended a federal trial in session. I need more than theories and nostalgia. I need verification." Deshawn reached into his coat and pulled out the flash drive he'd carried for the last 6 years. Never plugged into any system, never shown to any agency. He set it on the table. "This has my full Mosaic file, real file, not the redacted nonsense the Bureau archived." The ADAD raised an eyebrow. "You're telling us the government covered this up?" "No," Deshawn replied. "I'm telling you they erased me. With purpose." The judge narrowed his gaze. "Erased?" Deshawn nodded slowly. 6 years ago, I wasn't a civilian consultant. I wasn't even just an undercover agent. I was part of a Tier 3 program designed to root out internal corruption within the justice system itself." He paused, letting the truth settle. "I wasn't just assigned to investigate Mosaic. I was embedded in a program called LexPhase. Internal code. You've never heard of it. You weren't supposed to," Deshawn said. "LexPhase was experimental. They created operatives who looked like interns, paralegals, clerks, and people who belonged in the system's blind spots. We were trained to act like we belonged in firms, courthouses. I was placed in a mid-level law office on purpose, the same one that used to feed cases to Drexel Marion before he disappeared and re-emerged as Avery." The judge blinked. "You were a law clerk? Technically a junior associate in rotation," Deshawn replied. "But my task was clear: identify how Mosaic was filtering legal protection into its operational structure." He hesitated, then added, "The first 2 months I reported to a handler named Casey Brandt. He vanished on day 62. I never heard from him again." The ADA crossed her arms. "You're saying Drex knew?" Deshawn looked straight at her. "He more than knew. He's the one who edited my file." The judge leaned back, her brow furrowed. "Explain." Deshawn reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper, old, worn, creased by time. He unfolded it carefully and laid it beside the flash drive. "This is my original LexPhase intake summary, dated, coded, and scanned. Read the handler ID signature at the bottom." The ADA squinted. S4A, Marion Drex under the alias Avery, was brought in not just as a rehabilitated source. He was given access, trusted to manage a few of us embedded agents under the pretense of legal mentorship. It was the Bureau's way of testing whether a reformed asset could work from the inside. What they didn't know was that he was rewriting us. The judge stood abruptly, walking to the window, her robes sweeping behind her like a storm cloud. You're telling me this lawyer was assigned to you as your handler? He wasn't just assigned, Deshawn said. He was in charge of my clearance gate. Every report I sent up the chain passed through his filtering before going federal. And while he was reading my reports, he was also deleting entries from the system, replacing files, rerouting data. He inhaled deeply. When I tried to pull my full file after the bust went south, it said my ID didn't exist. My credentials showed entry-level civilian consultant. Like I had never served. He looked at Zorro, who remained still but not silent. His presence alone a statement. That's why I had to go rogue. That's why I carried the unfiltered drive. The ADA grabbed the flash drive, hesitated, then slid it into the secured courtroom laptop. The screen flickered as a folder tree emerged, more than 300 entries, all with matching date stamps, mission logs, codeword memos, and handler interactions. She clicked the top file, video loaded. Grainy footage of a warehouse operation played. Deshawn appeared on screen, his voice narrating in real time, movements smooth, tactical, deliberate. Then came Drex. Younger, thinner, but unmistakable. Agent Briggs, his voice echoed through the laptop speakers. I need you to maintain distance. Our legal assets can't risk exposure yet. The clip ended. The ADA leaned back slowly, her face drained. My God. Deshawn reached across the table and clicked another file. This one opened a PDF of his service history. On page 3, near the bottom, a bold line was stamped, subject status updated by Administrator A. Marion, level reclassified to inactive, designation scrubbed per Lex Phase Directive 9 Delta. He tapped it. He wiped wrote me out of the system, and no one questioned it. The judge turned, her face now taut with something. This can't go public, she said, more to herself than to them. If what you're saying is true, this entire building is compromised. It's already compromised, Sean answered quietly. He's been playing the system for years, using it to move people into places of influence. Jurors, clerks, maybe even sitting attorneys. He looked back at the door. And now he's sending signals to restart the network. This trial is the fuse. The ADA stared at the screen, then whispered, What do you need from us? Deshawn didn't blink. Access to the courthouse records, staff rotations, visitors' logs. I need to see who's touched files connected to Kane, Drex, and the jurors over the past 90 days. He paused. And I need you to keep me in that courtroom. The judge opened her mouth to respond, but then someone knocked on the chamber door. Once, twice, exact, the knock pattern. Deshawn's blood ran cold. Zorro rose. Low growl, the kind that vibrated through bone. Deshawn moved his hand slowly toward the doorknob, because he recognized that knock. He'd used it once himself. Years ago, during a Kodak operation where the only safe house had been manned by. The knock on the chamber door froze every breath in the room. Deshawn stepped forward instinctively, one hand gripping Zorro's leash while the other rested on the butt of a holstered sidearm he hadn't worn in years but now strapped to his side like muscle memory. The knock repeated. Same rhythm, 2 sharp, 1 pause, 2 again. It wasn't just a sound. It was a code. A mosaic call sign used only during fallback operation. The judge moved to speak, but Deshawn raised a hand. He stepped closer, twisted the knob slowly, and cracked the door open just enough to see the face on the other side, a janitor, uniformed, holding a mop. But Deshawn didn't buy it. The man's posture was too tight, his hands too clean, his eyes too direct. Zorro growled low in his chest, stepping forward uncommanded. The man smiled slightly. They're listening, he mouthed. Then he slipped a small folded paper through the gap, turned, and walked away as if nothing had happened. Deshawn snatched the paper and closed the door behind him, unfolding it quickly as the judge and Ada stared. It contained nothing but a crude floor plan sketch of the courthouse's sub-level archives, and one red X marked beside a handwritten word, Echo. Deshawn's heart pounded as the pieces rearranged themselves in his head. Echo had been the code name for one of Mosaic's earliest communication drops, a physical location used when digital lines were compromised. If the X was real, It meant Drex or someone working for him had stashed something beneath the very courthouse they were using to prosecute his proxy. Without waiting, Deshawn turned to the judge. "Need access to the lower records vaults. Unofficial access. No one else. And I need 5 minutes." The judge hesitated, but something in her expression had changed since seeing his file. No longer resistance, but something closer to reluctant belief. "Take the west stairwell. I'll clear the corridor under archive code habeas for 12 minutes, she said. "That's all I can give you." Deshawn nodded once and slipped out of the chamber with Zoro tight by his side. The stairwell was quiet, echoing only the creak of each step beneath his boots. As he descended into the concrete belly of the courthouse, he felt Zoro pulling ever so slightly forward, his nose twitching, tail rigid. They reached the basement level and moved past stacks of unused equipment, file cabinets too old to digitize, and broken evidence lockers. The red X on the paper corresponded with a far wall, old brick and half covered in dust-stained tarp we saw just then. Deshawn removed the tarp gently, revealing the faintest markings etched into the surface symbols, almost ancient, written in Mosaic's earliest cipher language. He hadn't seen them in years, but Zoro reacted first. The dog let out a low, reverent sound, not a growl, not a bark, but recognition. Then, without command, Zoro pressed his paw against a seam in the wall. He scraped once, then twice. Deshawn knelt and helped pull the loosened mortar away, until a narrow hollow revealed itself, just large enough to house a flat, wrapped bundle. Inside was a sealed evidence bag, yellowed by time but intact. Deshawn peeled it open. Inside, a black and white photograph of a corpse, face obscured by blood, with a single identifier and an insignia tattooed on the neck, the same mosaic snake and star as the bracelet Drex had dropped. The case number scratched into the edge was familiar. It had haunted him once. Case X91 are filed as unsolved homicide. The victim had been a former syndicate member turned whistleblower named Raul Stitch Moreno, murdered during a time when Drex had supposedly gone underground. At the time, no suspect was ever identified. The only clue left at the scene had been a unique laceration pattern, 3 horizontal knife strokes across the victim's neck and chest, and defensive wounds consistent with a left-handed attacker wielding a reverse grip. Deshawn swallowed. He remembered the details vividly. The attack had been brutal, deliberate, and according to forensic reconstruction, the killer had suffered a retaliatory bite to the forearm, a deep, jagged canine imprint estimated to leave permanent nerve scarring. He stood, turned to Zoro. "You didn't just attack Drex that night," he whispered. "You marked him." He opened his phone and pulled up the high-control footage from the outburst 2 days earlier, the moment Drex reached to brace himself during Zoro's intervention. He zoomed in, frame by frame, until Drex's sleeve slid up slightly past his wrist. There it was, a raised, warped scar cutting across the underside of his left forearm, pale and textured exactly as the report had described. A bite mark from a dog trained to immobilize and protect. From Zoro, the timing no longer mattered. The name change, the legal facade, the erased files, it all collapsed beneath the weight of that scar. Drex hadn't just manipulated records. He had murdered a whistleblower and faked his own exit from the syndicate's dark tier. And now, like some resurrected ghosts dressed in suits, he was crawling back into legitimacy through polished courtrooms and corrupted jurors. Deshawn backed away from the wall, evidence in hand, his heart thudding like a war drum. Zoro remained perfectly still, watching the hallway behind them. The leash felt like a thread between past and present. Suddenly, footsteps echoed from the stairs. Not loud but fast, trained, too steady to be random. Deshawn clicked his flashlight off, flattening against the wall, pulling Zoro close. 2 silhouettes emerged in the hallway, both wearing janitor uniforms. One carried a mop, the other a crowbar. The angle of their shoulders, it was all wrong. These weren't staff, these were cleaners of another kind. Mosaic operatives. Still active, still listening. Zoro didn't growl this time. He just braced. Deshawn didn't breathe until the 2 imposters in janitor uniforms passed the corridor without noticing him. Tucked behind the old pillar beside the wall where Zoro now stood frozen. Tails stiff but quiet, ears rotating with precision. The air in the basement archives felt colder now, not just from the thick layers of stone and sealed time, but from the pressure of truth finally pressing through layers of deception that had existed for almost a decade. With the scar confirmed, the hidden evidence recovered, and the syndicate's code revived in a courtroom, the clock no longer ticked quietly. It pounded. He slipped the recovered evidence bag into a protective pouch beneath his coat and followed Zorro out of the lower vault. Each step upward toward daylight, like ascending from a buried secret, back into a world where the truth might finally matter. By the time he re-entered the courtroom, chaos had already taken its seat at the front row. A ripple had run through the jury. Juror 7 Daniel Reeves, aka Danny Hex, was gone. His seat was empty, his nameplate removed, and the courtroom buzzed like a disrupted hive. The judge looked unusually stern, and the ADA whispered urgently into her tablet. Deshawn pushed through the side barrier and made his way toward her, stopping when her eyes found his. She leaned toward him. Juror 7 filed an emergency request for recusal last night, she said. He cited medical distress, migraines. PTSD triggers something about the dog. Convenient, Deshawn muttered. And bullshit. Wait, she added. That's not the part you'll care about. She tapped the screen of her tablet, then turned it toward him. This came in with the recusal packet. No one asked for it. No one even flagged it as important until I listened. He left a recording. Deshawn took the device and inserted his earpiece. The audio crackled for a second before the voice began calm, low, deliberate. My name is Daniel Reeves. Some people used to call me Hex. I guess if you're hearing this, then I finally found the nerve to say what I should have said years ago. A pause. Breathing, then. I was part of Mosaic. I wasn't top tier. I was a runner, a signal carrier. We didn't always use words too risky, too easy to trace. Drexel Marion, he taught us how to speak with our hands. Wrist flicks, finger counts, palm codes. He said if our mouths were ever taped, we'd still have a voice. He made sure of that. Deshawn felt his jaw clench. The voice continued, growing steadier. I knew the moment I saw him walk in that courtroom, calling himself Counselor Avery, that it was him. Same posture, same rhythms. And when he scratched his wrist and Kane tapped his shoe twice, I knew it was back. It wasn't a trial. It was a transmission. Another pause, the voice cracked slightly now, carrying something closer to shame. It went along with it for 2 days. I answered his gestures. I wrote what he signaled. But then the dog reacted. That dog looked at me like it saw through everything. And maybe it did. Maybe it recognized the code. Or maybe it saw what I've become. A man too scared to run, too broken to fight, and too loyal to a ghost that never earned it. There was a long silence on the tape. Then the voice returned, this time more rushed, more urgent. I'm walking away. I'm pulling the plug. I'm not waiting for Drex to notice. I left this recording in my jury locker. It's labeled Echo. He'll know what that means, and if you play this in court, he'll know I finally broke rank. The audio ended with a click. Deshawn removed the earpiece slowly and handed the device back to the AD. Her expression was already different. More than just skeptical, she was angry. We have him, she whispered. Not just on symbols or theory. We have voice. We have confession, and you have that bite scar, don't you? Deshawn nodded. I have everything I need to bury him, he said. But we have to do it in front of 12 people, and half of them might be his. The ADA looked back toward the now 11 jurors. We can strike them. We have reason. We have that audio, and we can initiate a bench review under Section 5E. Deshawn's mind was already moving faster. No, we don't take this underground again. That's what they want. We expose him, we force the code into daylight. The judge called a recess and summoned both legal teams to her bench. Deshawn walked toward the defense table instead, Zorro matching him step for step. Drex stood slowly, eyes locked on the dog first, then Deshawn. You've stirred the pot well, Drex said under his breath. But chaos doesn't scare me. I built. Deshawn smiled without humor. No, he replied quietly. You just borrowed it. Then, louder to the judge. Your Honor, we'd like to introduce new evidence, tied to a direct witness statement from the recused juror. It connects the defense attorney to the training and activation of criminal signals inside this very courtroom. The judge blinked. The courtroom hushed. Drex shifted slightly and Deshawn saw a gesture, subtle but real. Not toward Kane this time, toward the court reporter. Zorro's muscles stiffened. The air tightened. Something else had just been signaled. Something live. The courtroom bristled as Deshawn froze. His eyes locked on Drex's subtle hand movement. That faint twitch of the thumb toward the court reporter. Not long enough for most eyes to catch. But Zorro caught it first, issuing a deep, low growl that vibrated against the courtroom tile, like a pressure wave from a coming storm. Drex turned his body just enough to shield the motion, but the damage was already done. Deshawn stepped forward, placing one palm flat on the prosecution table as the judge raised a brow, her voice already taut. "Mr. Briggs, do you have cause for disruption?" "Cause, Your Honor," Deshawn said without looking away from Drex. "Have bloodlines, scars, and now missing bodies." He pulled a small clear pouch from his coat and placed it carefully on the table. The bracelet Drex had dropped, cleaned, dusted, and now fully processed through forensics. "We ran a material trace on the leather," Deshawn continued. "Found particular residues from at least 3 distinct geographic sites, none of which connect to the legal district Drex claims to have operated in for the past 10 years. The ADA added, "One of the sites is an abandoned construction zone near South Marlin Heights, previously used as a syndicate fallback point in 2014. The second is a dockyard in New Jersey, flagged in 5 missing persons reports." The judge's tone dropped. "And the third?" Deshawn didn't blink. "A kennel and training facility in Black Ridge County, shut down 6 years ago after a federal investigation into illegal canine combat enhancement procedures. That facility was the last known location of a handler named Alton Pierce." She hesitated. "That name is unfamiliar to this court." "It wouldn't be," Deshawn said. "He was never part of the public registry. Alton was the black-ear trainer assigned to Zorro before me. A master of high years behavior modeling, field mimicry, and anti-code imprinting. He trained Zorro to smell out Mosaic's gesture network, not just respond, but decode and act on it. He built Zorro into the only canine Mosaic couldn't manipulate." He looked down at the dog now lying in perfect stillness at his feet. 3 weeks after that program ended, Alton disappeared. Official word said he was transferred to a contract job in Qatar. "I never bought it." The ADA pulled a photo from her binder and placed it on the screen for the judge to see. A weathered image of a smiling man in desert fatigues, standing beside a younger Zorro in his first tactical harness. "This is Pierce, 2 weeks before his transfer. The night he disappeared, his dog, a secondary German shepherd named Ajax, was found roaming near the Black Ridge facility. Blood on its coat, a tooth broken. There were signs of a struggle, but no body, no suspects. Until now." She clicked the remote again. A freeze frame from a grainy surveillance camera appeared, taken the same night, same region. A blurry figure stepping into a black vehicle. The figure had a limp, and a mark on the left forearm, or still was pulled from a highway cam 3 miles from the site. The timestamp places it just hours after Alton went dark. The man in the image is the same height, weight, and gait as Drexel Marion. Forensics matched the bracelet's fibers to residue found in the back seat of that same car, impounded months later in a separate investigation into off-book transport between New York and Black Ridge. The judge leaned forward, her voice cold now. "Mr. Marion, do you have any response to these allegations?" Drex stood slowly, composure still intact, but his eyes, those eyes Deshawn knew from the field, were different now. Not confident, calculating. "Buying time, circumstantial evidence," he said smoothly. "Fabricated timelines, unconfirmed identities. Nothing admissible ties me directly to the disappearance of this." The ADA fired back. "Then explain why his name was flagged in a digital folder found on your encrypted server, under the alias Echo Target 3, along with 3 others marked as asset eliminated." Drex tilted his head. "How do you know that file was mine?" Deshawn took a breath, stepped forward again. "Because the same encryption signature was used in every coded memo you ever sent during the original Mosaic structure. Your own personalized syntax. You built it. You taught it. You didn't just defend this network, Drex. You orchestrated it." The courtroom's silence was thick as oil. Deshawn placed a final photo on the table. It showed a body badly decomposed, discovered just days ago in the woods outside Black Ridge, identified via dental records. "We found Alton," Deshawn said quietly. "And Zorro knew where to look, because the scent on the bracelet you dropped, it wasn't just yours. It was his. and the scent trail led straight to that grave. Zorro remained silent, his head lowered, but his eyes never blinked. Drex took a step back, not far, but enough for Deshawn to notice the shift in weight. He wasn't preparing to argue. He was preparing to run. "He'll bolt," Deshawn said. "He has a backup route. Check the vent access behind the witness chamber. He had it installed during renovations 2 years ago. That's his escape channel." The judge snapped to the bailiff, "Seal the courtroom, now." But it was already too late. Drex had moved, spun, and dashed through the side door before the guards reacted. The gavel slammed. Zorro lunged. The chase had begun. The siren screamed through the courthouse walls like fractured glass, echoing down the stairwells as Drex's footsteps pounded through the emergency corridor toward the maintenance access behind the witness chamber. His breath ragged, his mind calculating, one hand gripping the small pistol hidden inside his belt, as his other reached for the metal hatch he'd installed under the guise of ventilation compliance years ago. But before his fingers could grasp the latch, a shadow launched from the darkness, flash and fur, fast as instinct, righteous as memory. Zorro collided with him at full force, knocking the weapon to the tile with a metallic clatter, jaws snapping just inches from Drex's neck but not closing, holding. Warning, asserting the law, and the only way the law hadn't yet failed. Deshawn rounded the corner just behind, gun drawn, eyes burning with the weight of justice long denied. Drex sprawled beneath Zorro's weight, eyes wild, hands frozen mid-mashing. "Call him off," he gasped. "You'll kill me." Deshawn crouched beside him, weapon steady, voice cold. "He doesn't kill," he said, "but he never forgets." By the time the bailiffs reached them, Zorro had already backed away, returning to Deshawn's side like nothing had happened, like a soldier finishing a mission whose orders had been written in scars. The courtroom was locked down, Drex was restrained, and the evidence files, both digital and physical, were now in the hands of a federal review board that could no longer ignore the bodies, the coded gestures, the scar tissue, both real and institutional. Days passed in flurries of paperwork, press briefings, and late-end interviews. The Mosaic Task Force was officially reopened, this time not buried in secrecy but broadcast in headlines. Whistleblowers stepped forward, old agents came out of hiding, jurors were re-interviewed, charges were refiled, trials were postponed. Justice, dusty and reluctant, finally began to shift. But not everything was about Drex, because the day after the federal tribunal issued their ruling, a quieter proceeding took place back inside that same courtroom, stripped of cameras and media but full of meaning. Deshawn stood at the front row, no badge on his chest, no agency on his sleeve, dressed simply in a gray shirt and dark jeans, hands folded before him as the judge stepped up to the bench and cleared her throat. "Before we close today's docket, we address one final petition regarding retired tactical canine Zorro. Service ID 4817-Z." Zorro sat beside Deshawn, alert but calm, eyes bright, posture dignified. The judge continued, "This court has reviewed his years of duty, including his undercover operations, his behavior during this trial, and his instrumental role in exposing a covert criminal network that had infiltrated our very halls." She smiled gently. "By unanimous agreement of this court, we hereby reinstate Zorro to active status for symbolic duty and grant him the honorary title of Senior Federal Canine Advisor, retired with full honors." The courtroom, packed with agents, officers, jurors, and families, rose to their feet in applause. Not polite, not out of obligation, but full, heartfelt recognition of a warrior in fur who had done what institutions could not. Zorro didn't bark. He didn't wag. He just sat tall, receiving the moment with the quiet dignity of a creature who had always understood purpose better than politics. Afterward, outside beneath the sunlight slicing through the stone columns of the courthouse steps, Deshawn knelt and unclipped the last field collar from Zorro's neck. "You're done, old man," he whispered. "No more missions. You've earned peace." Zorro licked his hand once, then leaned against his shoulder. Nearby, reporters tried to push microphones forward, but Deshawn held up a hand. "No interviews," he said. "Let him have his moment." A woman from the DJ approached him that afternoon with a reinstatement file. His real file cleaned, unsealed, with full honors and benefits restored. She offered him a badge, a new role in oversight, a desk with a nameplate and a title. Deshawn read every page carefully. then looked up and said, "Thank you, but no. You could help rebuild the—" He smiled faintly. "That's the problem. I never wanted to be part of the system. I just wanted to protect people. The system forgets." 1 week later, in the south side of the city, in a lot filled with graffiti-covered walls and boarded windows, the doors of an old boxing gym opened to reveal a clean floor, repainted walls, and a new sign: the Briggs Foundation Canine Trust and Youth Empowerment Center. Inside, 10 kids between the ages of 10 and 16 sat cross-legged on a mat, each with a dog beside them. Some were rescues, some were retired service dogs, some had never known love, but all were learning to listen, to lead, to trust. Deshaun stood at the front, Zorro beside him, leash in hand, voice steady as he said, "Every dog in this room was once seen as dangerous, too broken, or too hard to control, just like some of you. But what they needed wasn't discipline, it was purpose. And someone who believed in it." A boy raised his hand. "Mr. Deshaun, does Zorro still do missions?" Deshaun chuckled. "Zorro's mission now is naps and teaching you not to trip over your own ego." The room laughed. Zorro thumped his tail. The sunlight streamed in from the high windows, cutting through the dust and past, shining onto something new, something earned. And in that warmth, Deshaun understood. Justice was never just a verdict. It was a choice made again and again, in every act of rebuilding, every hand extended, every leash handed to a child who'd been told they didn't matter. The law had failed him, the system had erased him, but he had never erased himself. Neither had Zorro. And now, the world would remember them both, not because they demanded it, but because they showed up, long after it stopped being, long after the applause. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more cinematic, emotional storytelling like this one. I'd love to know what part hit you the hardest. Was it Zorro's courtroom leap, the truth about Deshaun's past, or that final decision to walk away from the badge? And by the way, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment and let's talk. I read every one.